The auctioneer's voice, a harsh bark against the dry wind, sliced through the stagnant air of the dusty square. It was a sound that carried the scent of desperation, the metallic tang of human sorrow, clinging to the parched earth like the last drops of dew. Elias, a Cherokee rancher whose weathered face told tales of sun-baked plains and countless solitary sunrises, stood at the edge of the assembly, his broad shoulders squared, his gaze as unyielding as the distant mountains. He was a man carved from the land itself, stoic and private. His eyes, the color of petrified wood, usually gave away nothing, but today, a flicker of something, perhaps an ember from a long-forgotten fire, sparked within their depths. He had come for cattle, for horses, for anything that would strengthen his hold on the vast, unforgiving expanse he called home. He had not come for this. On the raised platform, bathed in the merciless afternoon sun, stood a woman and a child. The woman, Sarah, was a wisp of a thing, her hair the color of dried wheat, her eyes haunted pools of fear. Her plain dress, once perhaps presentable, now clung to a body that bore the undeniable curve of new life, a cruel irony of burgeoning hope in a tableau of despair. Clinging to her skirt, a small girl, Lily, perhaps 5 years old, her face pale, her delicate features marred by the blankness of sightless eyes. A hush fell over the crowd, a collective breath held, not in reverence but in morbid fascination. This was the raw, unvarnished spectacle of human suffering reduced to commodity, a chilling testament to the harsh realities of a world that offered little mercy to the vulnerable. Elias felt a familiar knot tighten in his gut, a cold, hard stone of revulsion for the callousness of men. But beneath it, a strange, unbidden curiosity stirred. What fates had driven them to this precipice? What desperation clung to their very essence, making them a spectacle? The air thickened, heavy with the unspoken judgments, the silent whispers of a society that prized strength and self-reliance above all else, leaving those who stumbled to be devoured by the wolves of misfortune. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice returning with a predatory edge, ready to unleash the final, agonizing chapter of their public humiliation. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Elias watched, his jaw clenched, as the auctioneer's gaze swept over the crowd, lingering on faces that betrayed a mix of pity and scorn. Then, the bidding began, a low, hesitant murmur, reflecting the grim reality of their value in this brutal economy of lives. No one wanted a pregnant woman, let alone one burdened with a blind child. The bids were meager, an insult more than an offer, each number a fresh wound inflicted upon Sarah's already shattered dignity. She stood there trembling, her face a mask of profound shame, her hand clutched tightly around Lily's small, unseeing one. Lily, oblivious to the cruel theater unfolding around her, whimpered softly, pressing her face into her mother's skirt. It was a small sound, but it pierced through the strained silence, a fragile cry in a world too harsh to hear it. And then a voice deep and resonant cut through the oppressive quiet. 500. Every head turned. Elias, stepping forward from the shadows, stood tall, his presence commanding, a stark contrast to the small, shrinking figures on the platform. The number hung in the air, a staggering sum for what was considered damaged goods, a sum that silenced the few meager bids that had preceded it. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, eyes darting from the stoic rancher to the bewildered woman. The Cherokee rancher, someone muttered. What in God's name is he thinking? Sarah looked up, her eyes, despite their fear, searching for the source of this unexpected, dramatic intervention. She found Elias's gaze, unwavering, impenetrable, revealing nothing of the tumultuous thoughts swirling within him. He did not look at her with pity, nor with judgment, but with an unsettling intensity that spoke of something far deeper than a mere transaction. It was a gaze that seemed to peel back layers, exposing raw nerves, hinting at an unspoken understanding of despair. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned, recovered quickly, his gavel poised. 500 once, 500 twice, sold. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed, a final, definitive sound that sealed a fate as uncertain as the desert wind. Elias stepped forward, the weight of his impulsive act settling upon him heavy and cold. He had bought them. Now he had to live with it, and they, with him. The road ahead, stretching out into the vast unknown plains, promised only more silence, more questions, and the relentless, unforgiving truth of a new, precarious existence. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The journey back to Elias's ranch was a testament to the heavy silence that often accompanies profound, unsettling change. Sarah and Lily sat in the back of the wagon, two fragile figures dwarfed by the expanse of the plains, their presence a palpable disruption to the stoic solitude Elias usually cultivated. The sun began its slow descent, bleeding hues of orange and purple across the vast sky, painting the landscape with a deceptive serenity. Elias drove, his hands firm on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but his thoughts were a chaotic tempest within him. Why had he done it? The question clawed at him, relentless and unanswerable. Was it a moment of weakness, a flicker of forgotten empathy, or something else entirely? A shadow of a past he had tried desperately to bury. He had seen enough suffering in his life, enough injustice to build walls around his heart thicker than any stone. Yet something about the desolate despair in Sarah's eyes, the innocent vulnerability of the blind child, had chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses. Sarah, meanwhile, clung to Lily, her body tense, every muscle coiled. She stole glances at the broad back of the man who now held her fate in his calloused hands. His silence was unnerving, more intimidating than any harsh word. She had imagined a cruel master, a leering brute, but Elias was none of those things. He was a mystery, an imposing presence whose motives were as inscrutable as the endless sky above them. Fear still gnawed at her, a cold, persistent dread, but beneath it, a tiny, defiant spark of resentment flickered. She was not chattel, not an object to be bought and sold. Yet here she was, her life reduced to a transaction. Lily, nestled against her mother, occasionally stirred, her small hand reaching out, exploring the unfamiliar textures of the wagon, her innocent senses reaching for a world denied to her sight. Sarah would whisper reassurances, tracing patterns on the child's palm, a silent plea for strength. As twilight deepened, the outline of Elias's ranch began to emerge from the fading light, a cluster of buildings, dark silhouettes against the dying embers of the sun, surrounded by miles of untouched wilderness. It was vast, isolated, a lonely fortress against the world, reflecting the very essence of the man who owned it. The silence of the plains was profound here, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant cry of a coyote. This was not a place for weakness, not a place for the faint of heart. It was a land that demanded resilience, an unforgiving crucible that shaped those who dared to claim it. Sarah shivered. Despite the mild evening air, the ranch felt like the edge of the world, a place where stories began and ended, where lives could be forged anew or utterly broken. She tightened her grip on Lily, a silent vow to protect the fragile life she carried, and the even more fragile one cradled in her arms. Elias pulled the wagon to a halt, the sudden cessation of movement jarring. He dismounted, his movements fluid and economical, and turned to face them, his silhouette stark against the last vestiges of light. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken questions and profound uncertainty. This was not a welcome, but a cold, hard demarcation of a new reality. The first few days at Elias's ranch settled into a rhythm as stark and unyielding as the landscape itself. The large, silent house, built of sturdy timber and stone, offered little comfort beyond its practical shelter. Sarah was assigned a small room, sparsely furnished, but clean. Elias, true to his nature, offered no explicit instructions, no elaborate welcome. His expectations were conveyed through his actions, through the subtle, unspoken language of work and duty that governed his days. Sarah, driven by a deep-seated need for autonomy and a fierce desire to prove her worth, took it upon herself to manage the household, cleaning, cooking simple meals, her movements quiet and efficient. She worked tirelessly, a quiet defiance in her every chore, transforming the neglected corners of the ranch house into something resembling a home, however temporary. Lily, with her quiet innocence, adapted with surprising resilience. She explored her new surroundings by touch, her small fingers tracing the rough grain of wood, the cool smoothness of stone, the soft texture of blankets. Sarah was always near, a constant shadow, guiding her, protecting her from unseen obstacles. Elias observed them. His presence often felt more than seen. He would sit at the rough-hewn table, eating in silence, his eyes dark and searching, occasionally resting on Sarah, then on Lily. He offered no praise, no criticism, his thoughts locked away behind an impenetrable stoicism. But Sarah, attuned to the slightest shift in atmosphere, sensed his watchful gaze, a silent assessment that both unnerved and challenged her. She wondered what he saw, what judgments he formed. Did he regret his impulsive purchase? Was he simply biding his time before casting them aside once more? The unspoken questions hung between them, a tangible tension in the quiet rooms. Sometimes, a fleeting image would flicker through Elias's mind, a small, dark-haired child, a woman's soft laughter carried on the wind. He would quickly push it away, a phantom limb ache from a wound that refused to heal. The past was a desolate country he had sworn never to revisit, yet their presence, especially Lily's, seemed to tug at the frayed edges of his composure, threatening to unravel the carefully woven fabric of his present. Sarah, too, carried her own burden of memory, a pervasive shadow that clung to her like a shroud. The shame of the auction, the desperate circumstances that had stripped her of everything, haunted her waking hours and invaded her fitful sleep. Her husband, taken by a sudden fever, had left her with crippling debts and an unborn child, a cruel twist of fate that had pushed her to the brink. She remembered the gnawing hunger, the fear for Lily's future, the slow, agonizing realization that she had nowhere left to turn. Each day on the ranch was a reprieve, yet also a constant reminder of her precarious position. Elias remained an enigma, a man whose kindness, if it could be called that, was shrouded in an almost painful detachment. He provided, he protected, but he offered no warmth, no solace. The only sounds of true warmth came from Lily's soft hums as she traced the patterns of the rug, or the rare, almost imperceptible smile that touched Sarah's lips when she watched her daughter discover a new texture or sound. This silent existence, steeped in the weight of their respective pasts, formed the fragile foundation of their uneasy cohabitation, a quiet negotiation of space and purpose in a world that had, for both of them, offered little certainty. One morning, as Sarah meticulously cleaned the dust from the heavy wooden beams of the main room, she noticed a worn, leather-bound book tucked away on a high shelf. Curious, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against its aged cover. It was a collection of Cherokee legends, stories of creation, of heroes, of the land itself. She opened it to a random page, her eyes scanning the lyrical prose, a quiet poetry woven into tales of resilience and spirit. It was a small personal detail that offered a fleeting glimpse into the mind of the man who owned it, a hint of a world beyond the harsh practicality of the ranch. Later that day, as the sun beat down relentlessly, Elias returned from the pastures, his face streaked with sweat and dust. Sarah had prepared a cool drink, placing it on the table without a word. He nodded, a gesture so subtle she almost missed it, but it was there, a flicker of acknowledgement that softened the edges of his usual reserve. Then, as Lily, guided by her mother's hand, stumbled over a loose stone near the porch, Elias moved with surprising speed, catching the child before she fell. His touch was firm but gentle, and for a fleeting moment as he set her back on her feet, his gaze met Sarah's, and she saw not the distant rancher, but a flash of something akin to concern, a brief lifting of the veil that perpetually shielded his emotions. It was a small act, almost insignificant, yet it resonated within Sarah, a tiny seed of hope planted in the arid soil of her despair. Perhaps he wasn't as cold as he seemed, but the warmth of that thought was quickly chilled by the bitter winds of memory and the persistent whispers that reached even this remote outpost. Elias, for all his strength, was an outsider in the eyes of many. The nearby town, a cluster of prejudice and suspicion, viewed him with a mixture of fear and resentment. He was a Cherokee, a man who owned more land than many white settlers, a stark reminder of a history they preferred to ignore. Word had begun to filter to the ranch, brought by the occasional passing rider or the infrequent trips Elias made for supplies. Rumors of increasing tensions, of cattle rustling, of land disputes escalating into violent confrontations. A rival rancher, a man named Silas Thorne, whose ambition was as boundless as his cruelty, was said to be stirring up trouble, eyeing Elias's vast, fertile pastures with covetous intent. Thorne was a man who understood only power, who saw the land not as a living entity to be cherished, but as a commodity to be exploited, and the people on it as obstacles to be removed. The subtle shift in the air, the way Elias's jaw would tighten when he returned from town, confirmed Sarah's fears. She had traded one precarious existence for another, only this time, the threat seemed to come not from within her own desperation, but from the looming shadow of external conflict. The fragile sense of safety she had begun to nurture threatened to crumble, replaced by a fresh wave of anxiety. Her pregnancy, a constant, tangible reminder of her vulnerability, made the tension even more acute. She was burdened, dependent, and now caught in a brewing storm that had nothing to do with her. The small kindnesses, the shared moments of quiet understanding, seemed insignificant against the backdrop of this escalating danger. Yet, seeing Elias, strong and solitary, facing down these unseen forces, a strange loyalty began to stir within her. He had, in his own gruff way, offered them a sanctuary, however conditional, and as the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the plains, promising a storm both literal and metaphorical, Sarah knew, with a chilling certainty, that their fragile peace was about to be tested. The ranch had become a silent crucible, forging a new, uneasy bond between Elias, Sarah, and Lily. Each day brought a subtle deepening of their intertwined fates, a slow peeling back of the layers that shielded their raw vulnerabilities. Sarah, driven by a desperate need for agency, ventured into the small, dusty library Elias kept, a hidden trove of books that seemed incongruous with his rugged exterior. She found herself drawn to narratives of survival, of women who carved their own paths in a harsh world. In their tales she found echoes of her own plight, and perhaps a faint roadmap to her own salvation. As she read, Lily, ever curious, would sit beside her, her small fingers tracing the embossed patterns on the covers, her head tilted, listening to the cadence of Sarah's voice, absorbing the stories through her mother's words. Elias, in turn, found himself increasingly drawn to the presence of the child. Lily, unburdened by sight, possessed a keen sensitivity, an uncanny ability to perceive the unspoken. She would often approach him, her small hand reaching out, seeking his calloused fingers. In those moments, Elias felt a crack in the formidable wall he had built around his heart. He would, almost unconsciously, soften his voice, explaining the textures of a horse's mane or the feel of freshly turned earth. He saw in her innocence a reflection of a purity he thought long lost, a stark contrast to the deceit and bitterness that often shadowed the adult world. Yet the past remained an unquiet ghost, haunting them both. For Sarah, memories of her husband's slow, agonizing decline, the crushing weight of their debts, and the cold indifference of those who had once called themselves friends, resurfaced in fragmented nightmares. She remembered the whispers, the averted gazes, the swiftness with which society had cast her out, deeming her misfortune contagious. And then there was Thorne. His shadow stretched long, reaching even into the quiet solitude of the ranch. Elias returned from town one day, his expression darker than usual, a vein throbbing at his temple. "He's buying up claims," Elias stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet heavy with unspoken menace, trying to fence off the watering holes. Thorne was systematically attempting to starve out smaller ranchers, to force them to sell, and Elias's vast, fertile land was his ultimate prize. The irony was not lost on Sarah. She had fled a world that had condemned her to destitution, only to find herself embroiled in a struggle for survival against a man who embodied the very greed and prejudice that had driven her to ruin. Whispers of Thorne's ruthless tactics, of his willingness to employ any means, legal or otherwise, to achieve his aims, spread like wildfire. He was a force of nature, destructive and unrelenting. Elias, she realized, was fighting not just for his land, but for his very way of life, for the legacy of his ancestors, for a world where honor still held some sway. The air on the ranch crackled with an unspoken tension. the quiet hum of existence replaced by the low thrum of impending conflict. The vast, silent plains, once a sanctuary, now seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable storm. The storm, when it finally arrived, was not heralded by thunder or lightning, but by the insistent, rhythmic drumming of hooves on parched earth, a sound that brought the taste of dust and desperation to the air. It was a raid, swift and brutal, aimed at crippling Elias and forcing him to abandon his land. The ranch, usually a place of quiet industry, erupted into a cacophony of shouts, gunshots, and the terrified bellowing of stampeding cattle. Elias, a warrior forged by generations of resilience, moved with a controlled ferocity Sarah had not witnessed before. He was everywhere, directing his few ranch hands, his rifle spitting fire, his presence a formidable bulwark against the invading riders. Sarah, clutching Lily close, watched from the relative safety of the house, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw Elias fight, not with desperation, but with the quiet, unwavering resolve of a man defending his very soul. In the chaos, amidst the shouts and the scent of gunpowder, a strange transformation occurred within Sarah. The fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a surge of raw, protective instinct. She saw the ranch, not just as her temporary refuge, but as the last bastion of decency against the encroaching darkness. She was no longer just a victim. She was a witness, a part of this unfolding struggle. When one of Thorne's men, his face contorted by malice, attempted to set fire to the stables, Sarah, without a moment's hesitation, snatched a bucket of water and threw it, her aim true, extinguishing the nascent flame before it could take hold. Her action was small, almost insignificant in the grand scale of the battle, yet it was a silent act of solidarity, an unspoken declaration that she, too, would fight for this place. Elias, seeing her defiant stance from across the yard, offered a fleeting glance, a quick, almost imperceptible nod that communicated more than 1,000 words. In that moment, a bond, forged in fire and shared peril, solidified between them. The attack, though repelled, left its scars. A few cattle were lost, a fence was broken, and the air throbbed with the lingering threat. Elias moved among the wreckage, his face grim, assessing the damage, his body language radiating a quiet fury. Sarah, however, found herself drawn to him, not with fear, but with a burgeoning sense of concern. He had saved them, had fought for their survival as well as his own. And then, as she watched him, she felt a sharp contraction, a sudden searing pain that stole her breath. Her hands flew to her belly, her eyes wide with alarm. The birth was coming. The timing, a cruel twist of fate, could not have been worse. The ranch, still reeling from the violence, now faced a different kind of crisis, one that demanded a different kind of strength. The impending arrival of new life, so fragile and vulnerable, juxtaposed against the recent brutality, underscored the precariousness of their existence and the profound, unspoken responsibility that had fallen upon Elias. The tension, already stretched taut, now threatened to snap, as two vastly different storms converged upon the isolated ranch. That night, as Sarah labored under the flickering lamplight, the old ranch house seemed to hold its breath. Her cries, raw and primal, echoed through the quiet rooms, a sound that tore at the edges of Elias's stoicism. He paced outside her door, his hands clenched, his mind racing not just with the present urgency, but with the phantom pains of a past he had painstakingly buried. He had fought battles with men, with nature, but this, the raw, untamed force of life emerging, unearthed a wound that never truly healed. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through his carefully constructed defenses. It was the face of his wife, a woman with eyes as dark and deep as a mountain spring, her laughter a melody he had long since forgotten. He saw her, heavy with child, her face glowing with a fragile hope, and then, the image twisted, contorted by the same cruel hand of fate that now gripped Sarah. A sudden illness, a fever that burned through the tribe like wildfire, stealing breath and dreams. His child, his unborn son taken before he could even draw a breath, and his wife following swiftly, leaving him a hollowed-out shell, adrift in a world suddenly devoid of color or purpose. He had built this ranch in the wake of that devastation, a monument to his solitude, a fortress against further heartbreak. He had believed himself immune to such pain, such loss, believing that by severing all emotional ties, he could protect himself. But Sarah's anguish, her vulnerability, stirred the ashes of that old grief, fanning them back into a searing fire. He saw in her struggle his own, the desperate fight for life against overwhelming odds. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He, the silent, emotionally distant man, was now inextricably linked to this woman's profound suffering and the miraculous, terrifying act of birth. He heard a cry, high-pitched and fragile, piercing through Sarah's exhausted moans. A baby's cry. A new life. The sound reverberated through the very foundations of the old house and through Elias's hardened soul. It was a sound he had longed for, mourned, and finally resigned himself to never hearing. He pushed open the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah lay pale and exhausted, but a soft, luminous smile touched her lips as she gazed down at the tiny bundle in her arms. Lily, her sightless eyes wide, her small hand reaching out, touched the baby's head, a look of profound wonder transforming her face. Elias approached, his movements hesitant, almost reverent. He saw the child, small and perfect, and then his gaze met Sarah's. In her eyes, he saw not just pain or exhaustion, but a profound gratitude, a raw, unvarnished hope that transcended their individual sorrows. In that silent exchange, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled, not violently, but gently, like ancient stone weathered by time and finally yielding to the persistent current of life. The past was still a wound, but now, a fragile new beginning had been etched into the present, holding the promise of an unexpected, profound healing. The immediate aftermath of the birth was a time of hushed reverence, a quiet stillness that settled over the ranch like a benediction after the storm. Elias moved with an unfamiliar tenderness, bringing fresh water, tending to Sarah's needs with a newfound attentiveness that surprised them both. The baby, a girl small and perfect, brought a fragile warmth into the stark, silent house. Lily, her gentle hands exploring her new sister's tiny features, seemed to blossom, her quiet curiosity replaced by an almost luminous joy. Her soft whispers to the infant, her sweet, tuneless hums, were the only sounds that truly broke the reverent silence, weaving a delicate melody through the ranch's sturdy walls. The external threats, though not entirely vanquished, had receded. Thorne, shaken by the unexpected ferocity of Elias's defense and the collective refusal of his other targets to break, had temporarily withdrawn, his greed momentarily quelled by a rare taste of defeat. The air still carried a faint scent of smoke and dust, a lingering reminder of the violence, but it was now overlaid with the fresh, clean scent of new life, a powerful symbolic renewal. Elias would often stand at the doorway to Sarah's room, watching them, his gaze softened, stripped of its former harshness. He saw Sarah, no longer just a woman bought at auction, but a fierce, resilient mother, a survivor who had defied impossible odds. He saw Lily, a beacon of innocent hope navigating her world with an unyielding spirit. And he saw the baby, a tiny, living testament to life's enduring power, a fragile promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. One evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and fading gold, Sarah sat on the porch, the baby nestled against her chest. Elias joined her, sitting a respectful distance away, the vastness of the plains stretching before them. The silence between them was different now, not tense or uncomfortable, but imbued with a quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the depths they had collectively plumbed and the heights they had scaled. "She'll need a name," Elias said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it, almost a whisper against the immensity of the twilight. Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting his. In their depths, she saw a flicker of his own past wounds, the ghosts of his lost family, but also a tentative reaching out, a silent offering of a future. "Hope," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Hope." Elias nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, his gaze returning to the horizon, But his thoughts, Sarah knew, were no longer fixed solely on the land. They were on the three fragile lives now intertwined with his own, on the quiet miracle that had bloomed in the most unexpected of places, amidst the harsh realities of a world that had so often offered only despair. The reckoning had come, not in fire and blood, but in the tender silence of shared humanity, in the quiet, profound acceptance of unexpected solace. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm, one infused with a quiet hum of domesticity that had been absent for too long. Hope, the newest member of their unlikely family, grew stronger each day, her tiny cries and gurgles filling the once silent halls with the irrefutable sound of life. Lily, utterly captivated by her little sister, would spend hours beside her cradle, her fingers tracing the baby's soft skin, her imagination creating a vivid world of colors and textures that her eyes could not perceive. Sarah, her strength slowly returning, found a new purpose in this shared existence. The ranch, once a place of forced refuge, had begun to transform, not just in its physical space, but in its very spirit. She discovered a resilience within herself she hadn't known existed, an inner fortitude forged in the fires of adversity. The shame of her past, though never entirely forgotten, began to recede, replaced by a quiet pride in her own survival, in the creation of this small, precious haven. Elias, too, found himself subtly changed. The hard edges of his stoicism softened, though he remained a man of few words. He would often watch Sarah and the children, a contemplative stillness in his gaze. He learned to anticipate their needs, bringing a freshly caught fish for dinner, or carving a small wooden animal for Lily. He still rose with the sun, still worked the land with the same unwavering dedication, but now, his purpose felt deeper, broader than mere survival. He was no longer just the solitary rancher, he was a silent protector, a reluctant patriarch of a family that had found him rather than been chosen. The past, with its bitter losses, still resonated within him. A phantom ache, but it was no longer all-consuming. The laughter of the children, Sarah's quiet strength, the very presence of life burgeoning around him, had begun to fill the void, not erasing the scars but weaving new threads of meaning into the tapestry of his existence. The vastness of the plains remained, unforgiving and beautiful, a constant reminder of the world's indifference, but within the walls of the ranch house, a fragile warmth bloomed. The land itself, so long a mirror of Elias's solitude, now seemed to breathe with a subtle, collective sigh of contentment. The spring rains came, gentle and persistent, nourishing the parched earth, and the green shoots of new grass began to emerge, a powerful symbol of renewal. The future, of course, was not without its shadows. Thorns still loomed, a distant threat, and the world beyond the ranch remained harsh and unpredictable. But the fear that had once defined Sarah's days had lessened, replaced by a cautious, yet genuine hope. The moral ambiguities of their beginnings, the chilling transaction at the auction block, had given way to something profound and unexpectedly beautiful, a family forged not by blood, but by shared vulnerability, by resilience, and by the quiet, transformative power of compassion. They were flawed, each carrying their own burdens, but together, in this isolated corner of the world, they had found a sanctuary, a quiet testament to the enduring human capacity for connection, healing, and the unexpected blossoming of love.